Yeah, okay, so
Yeah, I
I'll go
move
ahead
that
and call
we
the meeting to
adopt
order.
the agenda.
Okay, I second
Meeting's
that,
called to
Dr.
order. We got a
Morris.
motion. All right, motion and a second to adopt the agenda. I guess any discussion? Hearing none. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? Don't hear any. So agenda is adopted. We'll move on to the next item, which is minutes of the last meeting. Entertain a motion.
So moved, Mr.
So
Chair.
moved.
Second.
Got a motion and a second. Any discussion on those minutes? Okay, all in favor? Aye.
Aye,
Aye.
Joyce.
Aye. Okay, very good. Minutes are adopted. So the next item is any outstanding motions to come before the committee?
We have none, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Ando. So then we'll move on to finance reports.
Good morning, everyone. Hope everybody can hear me okay. I begin on page 10. That's where the financial package begins. We're going to do the financial highlights for the month of October. For the month of October, we're operating at a net loss of about $280,000. Our year-to-date comes to $1.64 million. Total revenue, we have period-to-date, we've taken in $1.67. Our actual year-to-date is $6.9, which is the actual budget amount, 3/12 of the budget amount. We're collecting about 19% of where we're anticipating, still lower than the 33% of the year that passed by. Total expenses, period-to-date at $2.6 million. So again, with expenses being higher than revenues, is why we're at a net loss. Michelle will be she does her drawdowns for federal money every quarter. So in December, this month, she'll be doing her ECHO drawdowns, which will bring us in a little more money and bring us out of the negative. Year-to-date, paid to the contract operator, who's now RAPC Dev, we paid $2.3 million. Other professional contracts that we have, professional contracts, marketing, and security. What we paid for this month are listed below. Total collections for the penny so far, we have collected $1.24 million of the $300 million that is warranted to us. From that, we have the balance there of $176. If you turn to the next page, page 11, where it kind of blows out where the revenues and expenses are by major categories. Close out, we talk about the cash balances in each one. So Wells Fargo, we have our petty cash there, and our main operating account. Combined, it's about $5.1 million. Optus Bank has our reserve account. Cumulative, there's $6.4. We also have reserve money in the local government investment pool, which is at $17.1 million. Any questions?
All right, any questions for Roz?
I don't have any.
Okay. Thank you, Roz. All right, so move on to the next item.
So that'll be the.
What is the next item on the
business enterprise report?
Okay. The next item is the Minority and Disadvantaged Business Enterprise Report. There's information on page 27 of your packet. And I would just like to briefly go over the document that's presented there. There are 23 vendors that are listed. And over to the right, in the next column, it says the comment paid vendor year to date. This information is taken directly from our financial roster in terms of payment that has been made to vendors. The next column is the amount DBEs have been paid to date. If it shows 100%, that means that the DBE is paid directly by the comment, and the other information is obtained directly from the vendors. You will see some blank spaces where the DBEs have not been paid, but the comment paid some of the firms. We are in the process now of getting in contact with those firms, about 5. And we have already, sent emails and also, mail via U.S. Post Office. So we are waiting to hear back from these firms, but we did let them know that if they do not make, contact us or submit any reports to us, then we will delay holding their payment. The next column is the minority or disadvantaged business requirement, and I just want you to see what the requirement for each firm. And the last column is the percentage of goal achieved, and this is just based on the DBE amount in comparison to the amount paid to date. At the very end, it shows the total percentage of 45.6%. That is very high at this time. I think it has a lot to do with the amount that, when you look at line 17 for RATP DAIL, the amount is about $2.3 million, and the amount paid to DBE are around $673,000. As of this date, we have only paid RATP DAIL 1 month of operating expenses and the startup costs. So there will be additional costs that will be added to this particular line, which will decrease the percentage. And at the very bottom, I'm also sharing that our goal, agency goal, is 25%. And how I achieved the 45.6% is just based on what we have paid to date in comparison to what amount has been paid to the DBE firms. And as I stated earlier, this amount is a little high at this time. This is the report.
Thank you, Dr. Prince.
I have one question.
Okay.
Thanks, Dr. Prince, for outstanding report. What's the 29% for RAP debt, line 17? Shouldn't that be 100%?
Well, what I did for this item, for the 29%, it just shows, if you look at the amount paid to DBEs, which is $673,000, I just divided that by the 2.3 million, and that's how I came up with the 29%. But as we pay, if once we pay RATP DAIL more funds for other months, so this is, as I stated earlier, the 2.3 million is only reflecting 1 month of operating expenses plus a startup cost.
Okay. All right.
So once we pay them for additional months, this amount, the 29%, will decrease.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any additional questions for Dr. Prince? All right. So we'll just take that as information. Thank you for your report. All right, so item number 7, discussion and action items. John?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, our first item I want to talk about is the RATP Dev startup costs, and just an update on where we are with payment of RATP Dev invoices. The first item we'll start is with the startup cost. At the September 2020 Finance Committee and the Board of Directors meeting at RATP Dev's request, we presented a change order number 4, which extended the startup period from May 1, 2020 to June 30, 2020 to become May 1, 2020 to January 25th, 2021. As a result, they provided us an invoice for startup amounts of $338,984.55. There was specific language in the best and final offer submitted to the comment on May 13th that stated that we would only process startup costs consistent with the startup budget proposed on 4/22/2020.
Excuse me, Mr. Andor, can you tell me what that banging is in the background?
Yeah, I apologize. We are having the air conditioning and heating system replaced.
Okay,
You want me to
thank
talk
you.
louder?
No,
help?
that's okay. That's okay.
Okay. We're going to talk to them to see if they'll stop. From the direction we had from the executive committee, they decided that 2 options that we would present to RATP Dev is one, either settled on the average startup cost based on our independent cost estimate of transit systems similar our size. That figure was derived based on startup contracts in the last 2 years, or that they provide an amended budget for this finance committee to consider. They've opted to present an amended budget. There is a disagreement on the interpretation of that language that you see on page 28 of your packet. RTP Dev is of the opinion that they can bill up to that amount regardless, and staff is of the opinion that it needs to be consistent with the budget. At this point, the revision of the budget that's being presented is for the Finance Committee's consideration on the following options. Either one, accept the revisions minus duplicative charges already covered under the fixed and variable costs. So in the spreadsheet that we provided to the committee, that would be things highlighted in orange and green that staff found as duplicative, or accept the revisions, period, or reject the revisions and continue to pay expenses based off of the April 22nd, 2020 budget submission, or other alternatives that the Finance Committee would like to recommend to the board. Some quick highlights of that startup budget so that you're aware. The revised budget that we received does show a cost of $457,972.07, which is $118,987.52 over the maximum amount. However, I presume that's being shown to demonstrate that there has been more startup expenses TPDEV stated that they would remove those costs on April 16, 2020, and you'll see that language below in page 29 of the staff report. And then employee uniforms, because that's within the fixed costs. Things that have increased since the July 28, 2020 invoice, and we would need receipts and documentation should the board opt to accept their revised budget, is professional services, corporate travel, transition project manager, office supplies, material and supplies, safety supplies, licenses, relocation, IT services, and computer software maintenance. Those had some significant cost increases over the July 28, 2020 invoice that we received. We also just noted that under employee recruitment, it seems like that training supplies were being charged to that line item versus employment recruitment activities. So that was a question of staff. The balance that we have not paid RATP Dev as of today on the startup cost is about $265,492.29. So, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to stop here at this point and just entertain your direction on, and then we can go on to an update on the invoices.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Ando. And just to note, I think I heard that Representative Howard joined the call. Welcome, Representative. We are on, sorry, we're just beginning our discussion of one second, everybody. I think we're going to try to deal with this background noise. Sorry, I'm sort of toggling back and forth between. So we're on item number 7A, which is RfPS startup costs and invoices. And John just presented an update on the startup costs. And so, as John explained, and as we've seen in email correspondence, the actual startup costs claimed differed fairly significantly from the anticipated budget in the contract. And so, out of the committee and board recommendation, there was the sense that we needed to get some explanation for individual line items in the expenses claimed as startup costs. And the proposal, I think, was to amend the budget in the contract through a change order so that the comment could then justify reimbursing the contractor for these startup expenses. And I think that, and this is, I'm speaking, personally, in my review of the changes, there seemed to be two significant changes. One was the startup budget anticipated kind of prorating payroll costs for a number of different positions. I think it's 10 or 12 different positions. And instead, in the actual expenses claimed, most of them are for one position, which is a transition manager. And so just, I think, an explanation to the committee for that change is in order. Corporate travel was significantly more than what was anticipated, and so sort of an explanation there. And then the IT services was there was a big difference between what was anticipated in the startup budget and what's actually being requested as startup costs. So I think that there are some folks from RfPS here, perhaps to address those and then propose some changes to the startup budget.
Good morning. My name is Steve Scherer, and I'm the Regional Vice President for the East Region for RATP Dev, and I'm going to talk to the questions that were just raised with regard to the startup budget. First of all, can everybody hear me okay? All right. So if I recall the questions in the order, I believe the first question related to startup expenses for various positions that were to be brought on under the agreement. One of the big challenges that we had whenever we commenced with startup, so that a limited notice to proceed was issued to us in late May. So that would have been the last week of May. So that allowed us to then begin to come on site and to start an official transition in a limited capacity. At that point, the original team of local leadership that had been previously approved by the board had been rejected. So many of those positions that we anticipated having salary and associated expenses to go along with those positions were at that point vacant because we had not because none of those positions were approved. So until we got an official notice to proceed, a full notice to proceed that occurred very early in the month of June, if I recall, we could not even potentially make offers to employees to fill those positions that were listed in the startup budget, fill many of those positions that were listed in the startup budget, because we didn't have a notice to proceed. So we were on a short time period. The original team was rejected, and so many of the tasks that would normally be performed by those folks during a normal startup were in fact performed by either a transition manager or corporate support, including myself, and other corporate support that lended itself to this transition. So I believe that would help with the explanation on why there were not charges associated with those folks. Once the local leadership team members were approved, we then made official offers to those folks. They in turn gave notification to existing employers, which in most cases were 2-week notices. So many of those folks did not arrive on site here in Columbia until either right before July 1st or some a few days after July 1st. So there were no expenses associated with those positions during the time of when we received our official notice to proceed and the original startup period that went up until June 30th. remind me the second.
The second question that I personally raised, again, I'm speaking sort of as a member of the committee, not as necessarily as the chair, because I want to offer the other folks an opportunity to ask as well. But the second thing that I raised was that there were a lot more in IT, computer software maintenance expenses than anticipated. So the budget called for $5,000 in startup costs, and the total was $175,000.
Yep, so there was a significant investment that had to be made into to the IT and that's necessary to operate service on behalf of the Comet. So very late in the game, we had to replace the equipment that was owned by the previous contractor. So the setup and installation of that equipment, there was no way that we could have anticipated that expense when putting together the best and final offer. We had never been able to assess the equipment that was on site, and in transitions in other locations, we've been able to either purchase equipment from the incumbent operator or been able to be much more successful in reducing the cost of IT. So our contractor that we use as an organization for IT had to make trips to Colombia in very short order to install, get the networks set up, all of which is very expensive on a short runway for transition. Also, one of the projects that we've been working on for some time is creating a new run cut for operations, which is requiring the use of another software system that we use to prepare run cuts, and also includes the costs of a subcontractor that's helping to manage the IT project. So again, some of those expenses were unanticipated because of the need to replace much of the equipment and to have our third-party IT consultant come and do the installation and all of the work to get the system started before June 30th, essentially, by July 1.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee? So, the key, some fairly significant variances from the original startup budget to the actual expenses incurred and claimed, the two biggest being the ones we just discussed. Any additional questions from the committee?
Mr. Smith, may I ask a comment?
I have one.
Yes, Dr. Morris.
Mr. Chair, in one of the proposals there, it indicated that there was some duplicated expenses. Could the regional vice president talk about that a little bit?
Could you remind me I know that one of the expenses that Mr. Ando mentioned was something to do with training costs. I think it was vehicle inspection costs.
Mr. Ando, could you share those duplicated expenses?
Yes, vehicle inspection costs, which RATP did said they would remove on April 16, employee uniforms. And then there is a question about employee recruitment, where from looking at the footnotes, it seems like training materials were billed under employee recruitment when no training occurred during that period.
Okay, that being the case, Mr. Vice President, then we shouldn't owe you for those items. Is that correct?
If there was duplicative costs, we're certainly not expecting to be paid for any duplicative costs. I'd be interested to know what the dollar amounts were for each one of those, so that we could reference that. But if there's legitimate duplicative costs, we're not asking you to pay duplicative costs.
So just for the good of the committee and this conversation, the two line items in question, the inspection of revenue vehicles, we show 28,425, and then for the employee uniforms, it's 2250. So a total of just over 30,000 between those two. I will say that, you know, those two items, you know, how should I bring this? If the committee were to decide to move forward with the change order, but to cap it at the original overall startup budget, those two duplicative line items wouldn't matter because they could come out and it's still the case that RapDev has expenses that they're claiming up to the total startup budget amount, if that makes sense.
Could I add, this is Steve Shearer again. You're correct. We do have ongoing startup costs that far exceed the 338,000. So if those those duplicative costs were removed, which again, we wouldn't expect any duplicative expenses to be paid, we can provide supporting documentation to support additional expenses up to the agreed upon 338,000 and some change.
So any additional questions on the startup costs, the proposed change order to the contract to sort of change the way the line items work in the startup budget? If there are no further questions from the committee, I'm going to allow Mr. Anderson.
Mr. Smith?
Yes, Ms. Dickerson.
When those items that appears to be duplications, can there be some reference to that in the minutes, how we address address those issues, whether in line read items or whatever? But I do think if there are duplications, they need to be displayed some kind of way or addressed some kind of way in those documents. Thank you.
Agreed. Yeah. Yeah, we can make sure that's part of a motion if the, you know, the committee so chooses. So, agreed. Okay. I think Mr. Ando has a few.
Yeah, I just
comments.
want to clarify a few points made by Mr. Scheer, just so that we have an order of magnitude on the timeline. The board approved this contract on May 15, 2020. A limited notice to proceed was both signed by myself and their CEO on that same date, authorizing them to spend up to $50,000. We signed the contract on May 29, and I officially issued a notice to proceed, eliminating that limited notice to proceed on June 1, 2020. So I just want to make sure that the startup period technically started on May 15, and they started to incur expenses there. So I just want to make sure that the board, the committee is aware of that. We did reject key personnel prior to the May 15 Board of Directors meeting, and we issued a letter to RATP Dev on June 1 as well, approving 5 of the 7 key personnel positions after we gone through our committee process on that. So several of those key personnel started between the periods of the general manager was on site as early as the second week of June, since we had meetings with him. The maintenance manager came on site 2 weeks before the contract started. Everybody else started after July. So that's just to understand the perspective of when key personnel came on site. The last piece about the run cut, RATP Dev agreed, or they made a decision to use the former TransDev run cut. OptiBus and the run cutting activities did not begin until July 6th from a correspondence we have from RATP Dev staff. So the OptiBus expense would also become a duplicative cost because that is included in the fixed and variable cost. So I would request that under the IT services and computer software, that it be limited to matters that are not considered in the fixed and variable costs, and Omnibus would be one of those.
The cost of Omnibus was not included in that. The outsourced IT support to begin that process was, and that's not included in any fixed or variable rate.
Mr. Chair, I would just request that they give us documentation to validate, since the budget that we have shows Omnibus in the fixed and variable, and the comment that was mentioned stated that they incurred under the startup expenses some Omnibus costs to do the run cut when that work did not begin until July 6th. And as I mentioned earlier, that they opted to use TransDev's run cut from the outset.
Okay, so, to sort of help us, I think, consider what we might, as a committee, what we might recommend to the full board. I think one way we can approach this is to say, you know, we have this proposed, we have a document from RfPS that shows the original budget and then the startup costs claimed. We do have where our staff has indicated the duplicative expenses, and then John has just made a note that there may be some things in here that are actually paid through, that are actually part of the fixed and variable costs associated with the larger contract. So, you know, one way that the committee might, one thing that the committee might consider is to allow staff to consider these startup expenses claimed to be an amended budget, authorizing them to pay up to the original $338,985 startup cost budget without ensuring that we're not paying duplicative expenses and not paying items that are covered in the fixed and variable costs of the contract. Correct? Is that correct? So
Is that your motion?
Well, I'm not necessarily making that as a motion. I just wanted to sort of help the committee think through it and get a sense from you and Dr. Morris, if you, and Representative Howard, I think you dropped off, but does that,
that sounds great to me. At least I would like to hear from Mr. Andor and Mr. Shear, I think his name is.
Yes.
Their opinion about this.
Yeah, Dr. Morris, I concur with you. I really support, I'd like to hear from them as well to make sure that the motion that is sent to the full board goes there very, very close to what we're trying to achieve. Thank you.
Okay, so Mr. Shear, and then I'll ask John the same question. What are your thoughts of that, on that approach?
Like I said, we're comfortable with submitting expenses that are approved expenses under the startup budget that are not duplicative. We have plenty of expenses that far exceed the $338,000 in the startup budget, and we can provide support to satisfy the committee. We're happy to do that.
I think I don't want to lose sight of what I think the committee is trying to accomplish is not just paying incurred startup costs, it's making sure that we've documented on a line item basis what the amended budget ends up being, if that makes sense. So what I think the committee would like to accomplish is that we're demonstrating that we understand exactly how the funds were spent on a line item basis. You know, for example, that a lot more than anticipated was spent on IT services and computer maintenance software for the reasons stated, and that we're formalizing that in this change order. So, do you agree, I guess, with that approach? Is that kind of how you're seeing this as well? That we're changing the original budget, not the total amount, but the way the operation.
You want to have supporting materials by budget line item showing the amount expended and support to support those expenses up to the agreed upon 338,000. Is that correct?
Yes, given the explanations you gave for the change in the approach from the original contract to.
We can provide you supporting documentation, and we will go through that documentation, make sure that there's no duplicative expenses, make sure there's no omnibus expenses, make sure that all of those costs are eligible under the startup budget up to $338,000.
The amended startup budget that we're working through right now. And again, I think the key for us is that I think as a public entity, we have to make sure that our own budget internally on a line item basis, I mean, we go through a pretty rigorous amendment process usually once a year, if not more often, twice, yeah. Where if a line item is off, and especially with variances this large, we would have to amend our own budget. And I think that's what we're trying to accomplish here, because these are public funds, and we're trying to make sure that, again, on a line item basis, we understand how funds were expensed and we approve it. And I think private entities don't function that way. I've worked in the private sector. If the budget line item's over or under, but you make up for it in another budget line item, it's fine. In the public realm, it's a little more, you have to actually show an amendment. So I think that's what we're trying to accomplish, and we want to make sure that we're all on the same page with that. Mr. Ando.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I'm fine. Well, I do support an amendment and a change order to that effect. I would just want to ensure that when we draft that change order, that it still references the language in change order 4, that at the authority's discretion that are considered under costs that are considered under the fixed and variable costs shall be rejected, and then all receipts and associated documentation shall be provided as it relates to non-duplicative expenses.
I apologize for jumping back in. Are you asking us essentially with this amendment to go back to the original line item totals that were submitted, that were discussed from back in April? Is that correct, what you're asking us to do?
Yeah, and I think what we're trying to accomplish is to say, well, we didn't spend $26,664 on a general manager. Instead, we reallocated that to a transition startup manager. We didn't spend, $18,398 on a operations manager. We reallocated that to transition startup manager. So again, I think it's easy to accomplish because I think we've mostly got the framework right here. But I just want to make sure that we all understand why it's important, I think, in our context, to make sure that we've done that.
Okay.
I don't think from my view, if the costs are, if you provide the documentation and it's not duplicative and it's not covered in the fixed and variable portion of the contract already, I think the committee will make a recommendation to the board that staff authorize payment. It's just that we formalize what the amended budget is.
Certainly, we can do that.
Okay.
And I just want to mention to the committee's information that the purpose of the amended budget is to to update what was submitted on April 22nd. But also, as some of the committee members may recall, this was one of the disputed items with the Department of Revenue under the TransDev startup in 2015. And DOR did initially reject the startup cost, and we had to negotiate with them to accept it. And the way we were able to negotiate was we were able to show them the startup budget, reconcile that against the fixed and variable to demonstrate to DOR that there are no duplicative costs. If we were to be audited again, the purpose of this exercise is to ensure that we don't have a similar situation that we had last year with TransDev.
Any further questions from the committee? Mr. Ando, Mr. Chair?
Mr. Chair,
Yes,
I would think that we would need to have all this together very, very soon. Because I would think that we would present this to the board next week.
Yes, so I guess out of the committee, and I'm looking to Pam, can we, make a motion to approve this in concept, and then the actual amended budget come before the board next week? Would that be, we don't really have it in front of us per se, but I think that that's a pretty easy exercise. And then that's what the board could approve next week.
Right, yeah, I think you can make a motion that you would recommend to the board to approve this with the adjustments that you just discussed.
Okay. So I'll make a motion to approve change order number 5, which reallocates original startup expenses by line item as discussed in our meeting today, excluding duplicative expenses and expenses that would be otherwise covered in the fixed and variable portion of the contract. And that an amended budget will come before the board next week.
Next week, yeah. And you want to add this up to $338,984.55.
Right.
Based on
Not to exceed the original.
Not to exceed, make sure you put not to exceed.
Right, not to exceed the original startup budget
based on a line item budget.
of $338,984.55.
Dr. Morris, are you comfortable with that? I am.
I certainly am.
Okay.
All right, so I made the motion. Do we have a second?
I second the motion.
Any further discussion? All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Aye, aye.
Any opposed? Very good, thank you.
All right, I just want to continue on, just to update the committee on the payment of invoices.
Okay.
So continuing on page 30 of the packet, I want to update the committee on the payment of RATP Dev invoices. RATP Dev has disputed adjustments made by common staff to their invoices. Page 30 gives you a table of what has been invoiced to date and what the comment has paid compared to what has been invoiced. There's been significant concerns with their invoices, and we've not been able to have a productive meeting to talk about these items. However, common staff is very interested and willing to do so. But some of the challenges that we've had with RATP Dev's invoices include, in the contract, bus stop maintenance is a separate pass-through item. However, we've not gotten a formal invoice for those expenses. In addition, we've not gotten an approved bus stop maintenance plan which mutually negotiates what the scope of work is going to achieve. In the contract, there's language that states that there's vacancies within the fixed budget that we're supposed to be getting credits of the salary, benefits, overhead, and profit costs. We've not gotten an accurate spreadsheet reflecting that, so staff had to analyze their budget and make those deductions on our own pending a future discussion with RATP Dev. We've not gotten ADA paratransit hours, on-demand, flex route, and food delivery hours segregated and reconciled to the trapeze report. Simply stated, they use 900 route numbers to identify those services, and we've asked multiple times, what do these 900 route numbers mean? And to this day, we've not gotten that information for July, August, or September. Should they give us that information, we can instantly release a large number of these revenues quickly. We've not received proper NTD reports with routes allocated to the right mode, so we've questioned the services of the NTD contractor, so those costs have been in dispute. We've been charged for mystery rider services that have not been authorized by staff, even though the contract is clear that the mystery rider cannot start until we have agreed to a mystery rider plan. We've been charged for services that were not implemented. We have continued to receive charges for services that were no longer needed. The contract is clear that they need to detail all buses weekly, and we've not been able to see demonstration of all of the vehicles, 104 in total, have been detailed weekly. We've not been able to get reconciled hours and miles to the reporting solution, the data management system that the Common procured prior to the start of the RATP Dev contract, which caused them to question the hours that are being invoiced. We've not been able to get accurate missed trip information, so therefore we've had to pull information from what their dispatchers have put into Solutions for Transit in order to determine what are missed trips. We have not been able to get invoices for specific pass-through expenses, such as the U of SC operations supervisor is another one. So therefore, we noted that this is an invoice we're waiting for, but we've not put a dollar figure, so we don't know what that is. And then lastly, we're getting charges for items that are under $10,000 that should be covered under the fixed and variable. At this point, we are willing to have a meeting with their staff to discuss these in detail, come to reconciliation, and then be able to process the invoices based on these expenses that staff has questioned. And I'll be happy to answer any questions if there are any.
So, Mr. Ando, at this point, this is just informational.
This is just information.
So our plan is to work through this with
Yeah, I don't know.
Rep Dev.
Pam, would you like to add any comments?
So we are currently working with RAPDEV's local counsel who's here today and the folks at RAPDEV to come up with a resolution where RAPDEV can be adequately paid while we are going through and resolving some of the issues, a lot of which pertain to documentation and report. And, you know, we certainly want to make sure that our data is accurate for reporting purposes, while we also understand the need for the contractor to be adequately paid while we're working through these issues. So we have come up with the interim proposals that we'll be presenting to the board on Wednesday that Mr. Ando has agreed to. And so I think that will serve its purpose while we work to resolve the specifics of the data and background and documentation.
Okay. And any questions from the committee on the status of the other invoices aside from the startup?
This is not, is this an action item, Mr. Chair?
It is not. It's informational at this time, but Pam just notified us that there will probably be something at the board meeting next week that will require.
Well, that's what I'm saying. This information seems to be very important, so we need to figure out a way how we can present this information that we received today to the full board. So even if we're presenting it as information only, I think the board needs to be aware of this information. Thank you.
Right. And I think that will be part of you'll discuss the specifics.
Yeah, Ms. Dixon, we will be making a more full presentation on this issue before the board about a resolution, how to move forward on some of these items.
All right, thank you.
I'll make one comment.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, sir, Dr. Morris.
I certainly agree with Attorney Baker in terms of what she just indicated. But I would think that, Attorney Baker, we need to go a step further. Too frequently, we are seeing information about invoices. It's either one or the other. RAPDEV not giving us the information we're asking for, or two, they don't know how to get the information. And it's just number two, I think our finance needs to work with their finance so we could get some of this resolved.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Morris. I think we've got a
Yes, sir, John Lay, and I've worked with RAPDEV. I'm a counsel for them. And this is not to, I just want to be sure this perspective is out there. I mean, what we're trying to accomplish is to work through any of the questions that have been presented. And there has been a great deal of interaction with council for comment, where information has been provided, where we've tried to alleviate any of the concerns that have been presented. So this, I wanted to be sure the perspective is understood that, you know, we're trying to provide the information for those things that where there's a legitimate concern to try to make sure that this relationship, it proceeds the way it needs to proceed. And we think we've accomplished that, and I'm hopeful that we will, you know, if there are any additional concerns, we can get to the bottom of it. Obviously, RFP is concerned that there is a tremendous percentage of their overall invoices that have not been paid, and we just need to work to a conclusion on that as quickly as we can. But that was it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I
So
want to add that it's 27% that has not been paid as of today.
overall,
Overall, yeah.
of course, it's
So it's not as large as perceived.
So it sounds like there's discussion among council, both parties, and that we'll have an update at the board meeting next week. All right. Any other questions on that item from the committee? Okay. So we will move on to item number 7B, which is further discussion about the CNG.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm asking that the committee recommends to the board that we rescind the use of CNG for the next 12 years, using a fleet of new buses for the University of South Carolina Transit Service, and to also remove this notion from Vision 2020. After the board took action on this matter in September, we continued to finalize a contract with TrueStar. They came back and reported that there was a miscalculation in their fuel projection, which increased the cost of CNG from basically $2.10 to $4.03. And then that's without the alternative fuel tax credit, or it would have become $3.53 per gasoline gallon equivalent with the alternative fuel tax credit. This is not an effective investment for the comment when biodiesel is going for $1.52. Since biodiesel is eligible for the alternative fuel tax credit of 50 cents per gallon and does not require additional infrastructure, my recommendation, we just abandon the whole notion of compressed natural gas, period. And then we are going to have a workshop in January to discuss other fuel technologies, including hydrogen and electric. And then just so that the committee is aware, in relation to the alternative fuel tax credit, we've received $116,000 for propane, and is projected to receive $519,030 for biodiesel for fiscal years 18, 19, and 20. And staff right now is pursuing the alternative fuel tax credit for both propane and biodiesel for fiscal year 21. One other point I do also want to make is that we are in discussions with New Flyer to provide us a quote to at least see what 2 electric buses would cost as part of the 12 buses that we are purchasing for the University of South Carolina service. And I would like to bring that back before this committee next month to see if this committee would like to recommend to the board that we attempt to buy at least 2 of the 12 buses electric. If you haven't answered any questions, if there are any.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Ando. Just really quickly, if I understood you correctly, there was never any contractual relationship with the CNG.
No.
The conversation started and then it.
Yeah, so the board authorized me to go ahead and negotiate and finalize a contract, and then that's when I learned this information. So I don't think it's in the best interest to continue down that path.
Okay, so are there any questions for Mr. Ando from the committee?
I don't have any.
Well, I'll make a motion that we rescind our previous action in regard to CNG.
I'll second that motion, Dr. Morris.
All right, so we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Do we need to, I think John's recommendation to us was actually to also remove it from the,
Formally remove it from Vision 2020.
Vision 2020. Do you want to include that?
I'll amend my motion.
Dr. Morris, I'll second your amended motion to include that item.
So we've got an amended motion and second on the floor. Any further discussion? All right, all in favor? Aye.
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 Opposed? Right. So is that, Mr. Lawson, did you join us?
Yes, he joined us.
Okay. All right, very good. Sorry, I missed that. So let the record show that he has joined us. I think Representative Howard actually had to leave, so. All right. So the next item, which is 7B, right?
Yes.
Sorry, I keep having it. Update on the banking RFPs.
Yes, I'm going to have Michelle Ransom speak to this effect. Michelle? Okay. 1 second.
Sorry. Couldn't hear me from my desk. All right, as you may recall, this banking RFP has been going on for quite some time. John's throwing things at me, guys. We got held up due to COVID. The RFP went out and proposals were due March 6th. We got 6 proposals. Unfortunately, COVID happened immediately after that, and we could not get a committee together to review the proposals at that time. When things started returning to normal, we did get that committee together, the review committee. They were gracious enough to review the proposals minus the pricing and scored it effectively. They were pleased with the proposals and did not need any kind of presentation. And then we, as staff, sat down to do the pricing comparison and saw that different banks had actually submitted different items for comparison, which made it impossible. So we then sent out a revised pricing spreadsheet and required each proposer to submit it and fill it out completely. And staff has reviewed those, and we are at the point right now where those prices have been submitted to our executive director for final review, and we should have a recommendation hopefully by the end of this month or early next month.
Okay.
Any questions?
Any questions for Michelle? I take it, just a quick question, the same 6 originally are still
in it.
okay?
Mm-hmm.
Everybody's still
And we're in constant contact with them, yeah. They apologize profusely, but they are all very understanding with what's been going on.
right. Okay. So we should just stay tuned.
Yes.
All right. All right. So if there are no further questions on that item, we'll move on to 7D, which is a discussion of resumption of fare collection.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. As you're aware, since March 17, we've been fare-free due to concerns with fare collection because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And passengers are boarding through the rear door since they can't access the fare box in the front of the bus. And this is also to protect the bus operators from passengers breathing on them while paying fares in the fare box. The board of directors approved this on April 18 to continue until the governor's state of emergency ends and to evaluate installation of bus operator barriers to separate bus operators from passengers. We've been using CARES Act funding to cover the deficit in fares collection since there's no local match associated with utilizing those funds. We have gotten most of the driver barriers installed. 40 of the cutaway buses have the barriers. We just piloted 2 of the fixed route barriers, And there is a potential challenge with one of the barriers that requires either a redesign of the barrier or a change of how the fare box is being placed. Yesterday afternoon, I met with RATP Dev's facility and vehicle maintenance manager to discuss what could we do to see if we can modify the fare box so we don't have to re-engineer the barrier. And he is going to look in to see if there could be a possible solution to move the fare box, flip it around so that we can continue to proceed with the barrier. We don't have to make any engineering changes to that barrier. 31 of those buses that have the challenge, we could potentially have this project done by January. If there are having to be some redesigning of the barrier, we're looking at March of 2021. For the 2010 buses, that barrier is okay, and we're going to move forward with New Flyer continuing that project. We are also preparing to issue an amended purchase order for barriers to be installed in the 2 minivans and the 2 trolley vehicles, and I anticipate that should be done by the end of the month. So at the present time, we were required by the board to bring this item before the Finance Committee in December, and there has been some increasingly growing concerns from some of our member agencies about the amount of homeless persons that are potentially being moved by the comment system to various areas of our service area. We're also starting to hear complaints from our passengers about the number of homeless persons that are taking up seats on common buses, which is creating people who truly need our system not able to access the system since we do not allow standees on the buses right now. So we're at a point where we may need to look at resuming fare collection, and I would like to get the committee's views on that. If the committee would like us to resume fare collection, I would request that the action be authorizing staff to implement fare collection immediately after we get the driver barrier project completed, so that we don't have to come back to the board to ask for that authority. If we to resume fare collection, we will have to add approximately, from an annualized basis, $269,000 back to the budget. Since we're at the 6-month mark, it would be 50% of that amount. And I'll be happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, Ms. Dickerson.
I truly agree with the homeless situation. It is very visible along the Broad River Road corridor. As I drive up and down that corridor, I see where the benches and the bus stops are being crowded with people who are probably non-paying persons going from place to place using that bus system. I do think we need to get a handle on it, because to me, I believe right now it is out of control. I started to call Mr. Andor a couple of days ago about the number of people that I'm seeing that I normally don't see, but I have been noticing that it's been, consuming a lot of the bus shelters, just sitting there, and just taking up a lot of time, and it's not fair to those who actually pay. So thank you very much for bringing that report, Mr. Andor.
Mr. Chair,
Dr. Morrison?
I would hate to see us resume the fares because of the homeless people riding the buses. I think what we probably need to do is do some research and find out what other towns are doing. I know it's a problem with the homeless riding the buses, and I understand all that, but I don't want to punish for regular riders because we're trying to cope with this situation with the homeless.
Dr. Morris, may I add to that?
Certainly.
Okay, basically, I think we need to figure out a way, not to punish those you know, those riders are not to. I mean, I have empathy for the homeless, and I think if they're going from point A to point B, you know, that we should accommodate them. Many of them are veterans, homeless veterans, and so I truly agree. But I do think we need to come up with a system or some kind of mechanism that we can address this matter rather than punishing anybody, but, you know, find a strategic plan and best practices to address this matter, because it is a problem. We just need to figure out how to address it. Thank you.
If I may.
Councilman Dickerson, I certainly agree with what you just indicated, but I think that you know, there may be other options, and may need to look into what others are doing.
Hey, if I may, Mr. Chair and fellow board members, I think both Ms. Dickerson and Mr. Morris are onto something. Finding a common ground. I think we should just have a further discussion about it, but let's use our barometer based on our local, you know, municipality. So as they start to open up and restrictions start to lift and people start to go back to work and they're not teleworking as much, then we start to kind of implement that fair policy again, where paying customers are only riding those shuttles. But until that happens, I think we have to be very to the benefit of having this free ride to the people that need it.
And just to answer some of the comments, I do agree with the position of what has been presented. I do want to let you know that staff is working on some initiatives to potentially help with this situation, and those initiatives include, I do have a meeting with a nonprofit organization that can help us potentially with addressing homelessness on bus shelters and on our buses. We did set aside $30,000 for this effort. So hopefully if this organization is able to help us with that, they would basically be providing that social service type of work to help people get access to the necessary resources that they may need. We also continue to pursue various grants to help subsidize free fares for a large number of our riderships, including seniors and persons with disabilities and low-income residents. And as we continue to get those grants, ultimately that can also be a catalyst to ensuring that those who truly can't afford to ride public transit still have that access. We could, since we were required to bring this item before the board this month, we can continue with the current process we have today while we continue to install the barriers, and we can give additional information at the next month's Finance Committee on how our discussions are going with that homeless outreach organization, as well as the grants that we're pursuing for free fares, if that's to the committee's liking.
That was actually going to be my recommendation. If, based on my understanding of the timeline, we probably still have some time to consider this, that you really were bringing this to us because we asked you to do so before the end of the year.
Correct.
And that there's still a lot of variables that we probably don't have quite hammered out, including, you know, some of the shields in the buses may take a while to get installed. And so, you know, unless the members of the committee want to make a motion, something to the effect of what John suggested, I would almost recommend we just, you know, make this a agenda item next month.
I'll agree with you. We could make it next month, but in the meantime, I think Mr. Andrew need to look at what they're doing in Savannah, Charleston, Charlotte, and maybe other towns.
Yes, and I can report that next month. I agree.
Mr. Chair, I agree that may I make a motion that we hold this in committee until next month and we get all the necessary information?
That's fine. Do we need a motion for that, Pam? Or can it just stay on the?
I don't think you need a motion.
I don't think we need a motion, Ms. Dickerson.
Well, I think we just need to hold this in committee.
Yeah. Okay. Any other thoughts on that item? All right, hearing none, we do have, one last item on the agenda, which I think will require executive session. So I will entertain a motion to go into executive session to receive legal advice, pertaining to, let's see, legal advice relates to pending, threatened, or potential claim or other matters covered by the attorney-client privilege, settlement of legal claims, or the position of public agency and other adversary situations involving the assertion against the agency of a claim relating to RfPS USA Incorporated. Motion to go into executive session.
So moved.
No second? I'll second
Second,
that.
but how do we do it, Mr.?
I think you'll just stay on the line, correct?
Yes.
Just stay on the
We're
line
going to have
and
that.
we'll,
Okay.
so all in favor of going into executive session, say aye.
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 Aye.